One quick reminder is that, so we have 1 week left essentially until the end of the project. And so this is what's going to happen in these few last days. One, you can submit your report drafts basically now. The deadline technically is until tomorrow, but with this particular deadline, while the survey, the weekly progress survey is due tomorrow, the report itself, technically the team can submit it anytime. So this week we ask you to submit the draft and submit it directly to turn it in. And so the reason we want you to submit it for us is because we want you to sort of have a deadline a little before the real deadline so that you know where exactly you stand, so that you prepare it in advance. But for you, it's an opportunity to check your work for plagiarism. So when you submit it to turn it in, it will take a few hours before you have the report, but you will be able to see if any parts of your report are plagiarized. And so what sometimes happens, not often, but sometimes happens, the team, let's say there are 6 people and all of them work very hard and everything, you know, legit, nobody plagiarized, but maybe there is one team member who somehow copied a few pages of, let's say, Wikipedia and put it in the report, and you don't even know that. Usually when that happens and when we confront the team member and say, so what's going on? The person says, oh, my responsibility was, for example, to describe the country, and I found exactly what I needed on Wikipedia, and my English is not so good. I thought, what's the harm? That's exactly what I was going to say, so I would just copy and paste. So if that happens, not a huge problem at this stage. You still will have a week to fix it. But the point here is that you will be able, to preview that, and you will be able to, to see the problem. And some teams also ask, can we submit the report twice or 3 times? In a sense, you can. So you would need to create a new account, and a different team member would need to submit it. The only problem here, and that's big, the system will see a different student submitting essentially the same report. And so the system will think that that second student copied off the first student, and you will have most of the report highlighted, and you will have like plagiarism level 90% or 80%. And so don't worry about that. We recognize that, and we will be able, as we click, so kind of check and tell the system that it's the same student or the same team submitting the report. But you might want to pay attention to that. Then next week on Friday, or by Friday, you have to submit your final report. For the final report, we will not give you the plagiarism statistics right away. And again, the reason for that is that sometimes some teams still have some problems, and but they cannot do anything about it anymore. And so when we give you the statistics, we get a lot of, not a lot, but out of 1,000 teams, there will be 5 teams where there will be conflict because of that. And so we don't want you to be too stressed, and we don't want you to fight with us, because as I said, at that stage, it's too late. So it is what it is. You could check your work for plagiarism in advance. Here we submit it, we check it for plagiarism, we'll tell your professors, we'll give the reports to the professors, and we will release your own reports a little bit later when sort of, all the emotional and the stress, go down a little bit. Then by Sunday, you submit the final report, final progress survey, and that's the most important one. So there will be 2 types of questions there. One, we would like to ask you more about your team and performance. So that's for evaluation, like the final set of peer evaluations, the final set of, comments, how your team did. But also we will ask you what you thought about X culture, what was fine and needs to be kept and done the same way next semester. And maybe some things didn't work well. Maybe some things need to be changed. So we need to know from you so we can improve it in the future. So please do take time to tell us so we know. If everything was beautiful, brilliant, great, it makes us feel good. We spend a lot of time on working on it, so good to know. But as I said, if something didn't work, it's fine. Then some professors will print your certificates. So we send, if not yet, then it will be coming out sometime today. The professors get your certificates, and most of them print them and distribute them in class, last lecture of the semester. Some don't, especially if it's an online class. So in any case, all of you who successfully complete the project, sometime probably around December 20 or so, right before Christmas, you will receive an electronic package that will contain high resolution, print ready certificate, recommendation letter, a very detailed recommendation letter, because again, we'll literally get literally hundreds of requests, can you write me a recommendation letter? I used to do it one by one, it takes so much time, so now everybody gets one by default. So you'll get that, and it will comment on, what you did and how important it was and what skills you acquired and, what challenges you faced. And then obviously your personal performance review and, either we recommend you or not for work, complex problem thinking and teamwork and things like that. And then in addition, we will also include your personal performance review for you, where you will see, basically feedback we collected both from professors, but also from coaches, but also from our own records. So you'll know how you did compared to the rest of the cohort, and then in general. And then also we will try to include your personal cultural intelligence report with recommendations, first with what those numbers mean, but second with recommendations for how you can use those numbers to sort of where you need to improve and what you can do to improve your cultural intelligence. We also took, this time you also took IQ test and emotional intelligence. Maybe we'll include those as well. So we have the numbers, you just need to sort of write up the proper, it's not one of those things where you can just give the number. You really have to explain, and you really have to provide pages of guidance for how to read those numbers, what they mean, and most importantly, how to use it for your own development. And then sometime right before Christmas, like, last week of December, by that time, we'll have all of the evaluations. We will first have selected about 30 or 40 best reports, and then we will have another committee that will look at those reports very, very carefully. And then of those, we'll select one that is the best report in each company category. So sometimes it may be a tie, but usually it would be like one best report written for Calgary International Airport, one best report written for Lady Bay Resort in Australia, and so on and so on. And so those who will be on those teams obviously will get an additional recommendation letter and certificate. And then as the very final step, we will select the best professors. So we have 187 professors this semester. And again, just like with students, some are outstanding, some are a little bit more relaxed, but some really, really work well. And, not only their students do extremely well and, on average perform very, very well, but also we know that they invest, go far beyond and above of what's expected of them. And so we want to celebrate that as well. So they will also get special recommendations and certificates. So that's briefly about where we stand. Now we have two wonderful guest speakers today. And so we would like to talk a little bit about cross-cultural differences in communication styles, cross-cultural communication, as well as about conflicts that may lead to, basically tensions that may arise when people communicate across cultures. And so we have here two professors. So we have Tatiana Kolovou, right? And she's at University of Indiana in Bloomington. And so what's interesting about that school, we actually had a similar situation a couple of weeks ago. When you talk about international business, all the major, big name, big brand schools are usually not even on the radar. Like when you go to the major conferences, like International Academy of International Business, I don't think I've ever seen anyone from like Harvard or Stanford or MIT. They may sometimes show up, but they just don't do international business. For some reason, they specialize more in kind of older disciplines like strategy and economics. But then there are schools that are really, really good at international business, and sometimes people don't really know them. So it would be like, again, South Carolina or Rutgers or St. Louis or Indiana for that matter. So in our discipline, that's the school. So it's arguably top 5, 10 maybe worldwide, literally. Yep. So then we have Ursula and NTU. So what NTU stands for?
Nottingham Trent University in the UK.
So right. So we have two continents here today.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure, we always prefer to sort of have a conversation, but I know you have some slides or some things to show. So would you like to start with a presentation, or we'll just share screens when the time comes to show slides?
Probably when the time comes, it's probably quite nice to do that.
Then let's start with a big basic question. So when people communicate across cultures, like for example, when people have a cross-cultural team like it is in X culture, why sometimes it's difficult? What can go wrong, especially with respect to communication? What makes it more challenging than when you have everybody is from the United States or everybody is from the United Kingdom? What's so special about them?
First, Vas, may I interrupt? And before we start our conversation, since I have just talked to you on email and never have communicated on the screen, and Ursula, just meeting you, tell me a little bit about, I know you're from Ukraine, and Ursula, where are you from?
I'm originally from Vienna, from Austria. And then I came to London, to the London School of Economics after my PhD. And from there, I basically stayed in the UK and continued, moved further north, and now I'm in Nottingham. Most people know Nottingham from Robin Hood.
That's what I wanted to say. Yeah,
yeah, Robin Hood land, wonderful.
Yeah, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Yeah.
Yeah, and your family is in Austria mainly, right?
Yeah, mixed. I still have my family in Austria, but I have my new family, my husband and my children, and we're truly international. My husband is half Polish and half English, and so everything in our life is just trying to communicate across culture as well in a daily life. So what about you, Tatiana?
I'm what I call myself an academic immigrant. I came to the United States in the 1980s. To go to university, and then I graduated, and then I met my husband, who is from Lincoln, Nebraska. I am from Athens, Greece. If you remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that all happened. The cultures are so different. And mixing the families and the values and the beliefs was a real life experiment that has worked. 26 years later, we're still married, but it was amazing. But now myself as well, I have children, 2 children, and my husband here, but my family is all in Greece. Vas, how about you?
Well, I was born in Ukraine. At the age of 16, I moved to Germany to study. I got a scholarship. So I spent some time in München and then in Köln. And then it was mainly Canada and the United States. So I did my master's in Texas, University of Texas at Dallas.
Oh,
and
Texas,
then PhD
that's
in
a
Canada.
big culture change.
Yeah, and then PhD in Canada, in Calgary, which by the way is not different from Texas at all. So you move from Dallas to Calgary, and so what happened is the same people, cowboys, everybody wearing hats, and everybody talking about oil and gas. So it's just much colder.
It's colder.
Yeah, much colder.
That's good.
And then my kids were born in Canada, so we spent a total of about 7 years there. So I taught for a while, and then it's been 11 years now here in North Carolina. So that's the longest I've been in the same place.
Yeah. So when you left, it was still not Ukraine. You were not an independent country, yeah?
No, it was Ukraine. It was 1993. So it was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I still caught a little bit of that. So still remember those times. And
a big shift for you as well.
Yeah.
So what I have to say about cross-cultural communication was just an example of what I did. It's hard for me to jump in and start working with you without knowing a little bit about you.
Absolutely.
It's easier to know where you come from, to get to know you a little bit. And I think sometimes, and I'll talk more about other things, we have the tendency to be very task-oriented and jumping into the work. And then when conflict happens, we have nothing to back into and feel or build some trust or find some common grounds of saying, Ursula, you have kids, I have kids, you're married to someone who's not from your culture. Where do we find a commonality? So for our students, I see quite often, I teach in the MBA program here at Indiana University at the Kelly School, and I find that the projects just similar to X Culture that are given out, the deliverables create pressure. And if we don't take time to break bread, as we say in Greece, with our teammates to get to know them, then that creates conflict that then is difficult to resolve. There's many reasons behind all of that. And of course, personalities play a role. But for me, I think it's taking the time to build the relationship first and then go for it, for the job that has to be done.
Absolutely, I can only agree with that. And from a cross-cultural perspective, we often see exactly that the people rush into the task rather than thinking about the relationships to build up.
Yeah.
And then as well with the relationships comes trust. And through that, we are much more successful in negotiations, in conflict resolution, to do that. And whether we do it on a political, on a managerial level, society level, we have always similarities, and building on them is much more leading to an outcome than being controversial. I find that is absolutely a very important lesson to be learned. And that continues in everyday situations and academia. And academia is a good example as well, where people from all over the world come together and there is a coherence because of exactly similar situations that we teach at other universities than we were born in the other countries. We have learned, but we have still our own cultural roots, which we take along, and then we build up on that. So that's the cultural profiles which we create our whole life through.
Talking about that, we actually have a study in progress right now, specifically on the effects of people spending time to get to know each other in X-culture. When we started 10 years ago, and by the way, this semester is exactly 10 years.
Wow.
Congratulations.
The initial, probably 2 years, we did have those weekly sort of deadlines, but we asked students to jump right into the task right away. So first deadline was select your company, next deadline was select the market, and boom, boom, boom. So you work directly right there on the task. Then for a few years, the first deadline, the one on Thursday of the first week, was get to know each other. So I don't think we had the test right away, but we would say, during this week, all you have to do is just communicate with one another, and we give you a little time to get to know each other, and then next week you will select the client, and we'll kind of go from there. Then at some point, people started showing the results of other studies that show that when people get to know each other, all kinds of good things happen because, they see each other as a person and not as two words on the screen, which sometimes happens. Sometimes you see like a foreign name, you don't even know if it's a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And so we started giving a little bit more time. And we introduced this acquaintanceship test. You remember students, this time, the first week, there was a test where you were asked, like each team member, does this team member have a pet at home or has a job outside school and things like that. And so that sort of prompted people to get to know each other. And then so in a few semesters, we actually moved it as far as 3 weeks. You do nothing, just get to know each other. So we're now writing a paper that literally looks at the acquaintanceship. So how much time we give you to get to know each other, and then how well you do on those acquaintanceship tests. And so we see all kinds of good things. Like, for example, when you look at peer evaluations, year in and year out, for 10 years, peer evaluations always are around 4.0, 4.1 maybe. So some weeks it may be 3.9, some weeks it may be 4.1, but it's
scale
never
of 1 to 5.
Yeah, on a 1 to 5 scale. So it's never outside that range when you look at the weekly average peer evaluations. It's always like literally plus or minus 0.1 points.
Sure.
When we added 1 week, so before that, it was actually 3.8. When we added 1 week, it went to about 4.0. When we added 2 weeks, it went to about 4.3. And then when we added 3 weeks, it's too much. So it actually went back to 4.1. Now, it seems like it's not a big difference, but if you look at what they call, the standard deviation of the numbers, it's a huge jump. We are talking about something like, it's like in the Olympics, like the world record, 100 meters, everybody was running for the last 10, 15 years, right around 10 seconds. And then Usain Bolt does it like in 9.7. It seems like it's only like a fraction of a second. I mean, big difference.
But that's a medal difference.
Like it's a huge thing, like, like a huge deal. Same thing here. So it seems like if you spend too much time on getting to know each other, let's say you have 8 and you spend 7 weeks just to get to know each other and 1 week for work, that will not leave you much time.
Get things done.
But it looks like 1 week is better than no time, better than 1 week. 3 weeks, that's when we see the effect kind of leveling out and going down a little bit. So yes, it does matter when people spend some time to get to know each other. We don't even know why. So we kind of speculate because people like each other more, people respect each other more. But those things are hard to capture, and so we cannot really claim that we know the mechanism, but we know the results. We know it works.
I was just I've been doing some reading on the social cognition that says that when you first meet a person, Ursula Voss, we just meet online, not face to face. We judge people on 2 dimensions, warmth and competence. Now, immediately when you meet someone, they can be very competent, very high in their ability, skill, their resume, but if they're not warm, you don't want to spend time with them. So the first thing we judge, the first impressions, which are not even minutes, milliseconds, you decide if you want to spend more time with a person. So Vas, what you're saying is it's important to spend time for people to demonstrate their warmth, to show that they're real, so they can build trust. So someone can say, if I trust you to be my friend, I'll work with you, we'll figure out the rest. Now, you don't necessarily get to want to be and spend time if you quickly decide they're not competent. If they're very warm and not very competent, think of puppies and babies. You know, they're very warm, but they can't get anything done. But that does not continue. So we have to build that time. But I think teaching our students, and not only our students, business professionals too. I have students that work now in big consulting firms, and their teams are in India, or their teams are in Indonesia, their teams are in Russia, and they have to meet just like we are and form a team. And if they do it without screen, without a camera, and they're just talking, for disaster, nothing gets done.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't hear about the swarm versus competence.
I can show you,
But it is very true that we judge people quickly, apparently. So there are a lot of studies on this topic, neatly summarized in the book by Gladwell called Blink.
Yeah.
But the important thing here is that when we work in global virtual teams, in many cases, we literally don't even perceive team members as people, because, you know, you literally see the messages on the screen, and sometimes your team member is literally just 2 words. And so if you don't have a Skype conversation, for example, it's very hard to, you know, to sort of perceive people as you know, personalities. And so research shows again and again that you want to have that personal contact at least a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah. And for the people managing those teams, that's also very critical for them to learn to know how to do that.
From my own research, I can say that as well. What I've seen, I've done lots of experiments with managers across the globe, and when I was in London, I was able to have in experiments people from China, from Russia, and from the government of Uruguay as an example, an interesting combination. And with these cultures, it was very interesting to see the amount of words, the amount of talking they used was different. So you have Chinese very clearly who have not been abroad, and that was the first time that these civil servants working for the government were coming for training, and at the same time the Russians came as well with a governmental background, and then we had the people from Uruguay, and these were the most striking examples because they come from a similar task-based background, but then when they were to get an experiment, it was very difficult to decode. So they made contact, they liked each other, what you exactly rightly said, but there were the cultural differences, and that was contextual. The contextual side, where there was a lot of verbal and non-verbal communication going on, and if you can't decode what the other side means, so the really deep meaning, then we have difficulties, and then we have the conflict. So finding out through these experiments that there is a deep-rooted connection when people use logic to negotiate with each other, then they have an anchor with each other. That's easy. When they, however, start to make relationship building situations, or when they want to go more in contextual sides, when they want to talk about terms of conditions, then they need to talk more. Then they as well need to use information exchange. And that is the difficult part. Even when they get on in the first moment, then it becomes difficult as well when they have to write things down. So what was just rightly said, when you have messages, they can be very short, succinct. And they can be like the low context situation, which we know from Hall, and the high context situation. But it is important.
More about this high and
low context. Yeah, high and low. High and low context cultures are going back to Edward Hall from very early on. He did a lot of studies in anthropology and used highly interesting stuff. He looked into when messages are explicitly transferred from one to the next. So cultures which are explicitly saying what they mean are the US, Swiss, Germans. They say exactly what they mean when they talk to each other. And the more complex, the higher we go in terms of articulating. So there are cultures like South Americans, Arabs, they talk a lot and use lots of words. That is high context. But also, if you have Japanese, Chinese, they speak less. So silence is as well a context, because nonverbal communication means that a lot of meaning is in there. So now you can see lots of clashes coming together, and with these cultures which I saw, it was so difficult to decode what they wanted to do. They had the best intentions to make deals, but then the difficult part was the information exchange and how they could do something in order to bring out a positive outcome, a cooperative outcome.
I do think that if there's trust initially in the working relationship, it makes it easier for someone to say, Ursula, help me understand. I'm missing the point here. But if you say help me understand to someone you don't know as well, it's difficult. I have to show, Vas, can I share some slides?
Yeah, you just click on share. There is a button.
I know. These are my funny slides, but I come from Greece, which is a very high context culture. And I first moved to the United States, and I was very surprised with certain symbols and things that I saw. I'll show you here is the slide that I share. So for example, I came from a high context culture of Greece, where there's a lot of communication through eye contact, through gestures, through not hardly any words. And everyone had a sticker in the back of their car explaining how they feel, their political beliefs, everything is on a sticker. So that was very surprising to me. And then the words that had a meaning, I would think when you go to someone's house, why do you have to even consider saying welcome on the mat? Isn't that a
good one?
then I walk into a restaurant and I thought, this is so nice. The owner is so young. And then I looked closer, and it was not the owner of the restaurant, it was the employee. Because in a high context culture, we would not show up one person and lift them in front of everyone. But Vas, it's so nice that you come from a high context culture, but you've created X culture in a way that is more, it operates in the US, and in the fact that you're rewarding the high performers and everything is specific and right. It's probably your personality too. You like to do it because that's how you operate. Where culture
although I will say that every time that we announce the best teams, the best professors, and I used to do it on the weekly basis because we have performance every week, there would be always like backlash from some countries, and they say, oh, I mean, how dare you to say that they're better than me, or why would you do that? It's like it's unethical.
Yeah,
it's unethical about saying who was the best professor last week, and they said, no, you don't want to do that, and so we just stopped. So because
it puts pressure, that's for sure.
Doesn't work in some cultures.
Another
so
example
with that menu.
Menu is an example of a low context culture where everything is written out, even pictures, very explicit. And
so that's why American contracts are like this, like huge big documents.
Yes. And you go to Greece, where I'm from, you say, what's on the menu? They go, come in the kitchen, I'll show you. There's not even a menu. Like, what did you show? There's the Americans go crazy. I see the menu and I go, don't read the menu. It's probably not updated. And then the other is everybody writes, again, like the bumper stickers. I thought, I was so surprised, a lot of words, a lot of communication through things that we wear. And then when I had children, they go to swim meets, they're swimmers, both of them. You put everyone's name on the back of a shirt. That would never happen in a low context culture. And in the business world, I have to say, the motivational posters, the teamwork, everything. You motivate people by putting the words. A few more things, because I think it's funny.
This is really good.
In a low context culture, you better not miss the fact that there's a scenic drive. Make sure you look inside. You need lots of signs. Now, I don't know if in the United States we have more lawyers or it's more low context, but someone sued because somebody didn't tell them there were rattlesnakes. In my office, you must be told you must clean up the microwave. You think like that's expected. But my absolute favorite sign of low context is the car wash where there's a sign inside that says stay in your car. Is someone that exited the car and sued because they got hurt and there was no sign.
Well, in America, if you don't put that sign or like
somebody's going to get out. Yes.
Somebody's going to sue you.
And
sue didn't say it.
Exactly. So I said there's probably more lawyers. But for me, explaining that both to the students that I get to take students to Greece. In fact, Vas, we have an anniversary together. This is my 10th year where I had a discussion with our dean of the business school 11 years ago at a holiday party. And it was when Greece was going like this.
Yeah.
It's still not down, but it's still coming up in economy. And he said, your country is taking down the world economy. And I just like a Greek, put my hands on my hips and I said, and your students need to learn about my country and everything else happening in Europe. And we're not doing anything to enhance our global awareness. And he said to me, do something about it. And I did. So I created a course that for 8 weeks studies the culture, the politics, the legal system, the infrastructure, the economy. And then we go there for 10 days. And we have a lot of interactions with companies. In fact, my teams, because I teach communication, we do a project. But now we do the same syllabus in 18 different international countries in the second year. So what I learned, though, when I did some research of the faculty coming back, I said, what else do our students need? And this is why I want to incorporate a new course in January with X Culture, because they said they have a hard time learning how to read a culture. So this will be wonderful to be able to engage and coach and educate the students as they go through it. Because I don't think high context culture people quickly can figure out the difference when they switch, but low context, I don't know, Ursula, I want to hear your concept. Going to high context is different. I'm not saying it's not possible, but you have to know the differences in order to adapt. So I'll be quiet. I want to hear your thoughts.
No, absolutely right. I can give you a nice example with England, with the UK. It's a very difficult country because there is so much going on between the lines, and lots of my students, when they come to the UK, have to deal with that. So one of the easy ways to understand is then to look into how people communicate. But I give you a nice example. In the UK, when you do something and people say, oh, that's quite interesting, coming from Austria, I thought, oh, they really like what I do. Oh, no, that's exactly a devastating comment. So quite interesting is actually a really horrible way of telling you that's a rubbish idea. And with that, we find a lot that we have in the UK, people who have really difficulties when they come to understand this. It is a low context, low context, but also high context, by not saying enough or saying not so much what you could use in this context.
Sure.
Or, for instance, when you come and say, how are you? There are lots of cultures where you really want to tell how you are. Yeah. And they don't want to know. Absolutely, they do not want to know. They just want to say, hi, that's it. And that's how are you.
Still remember when people say, how are you? And you open your mouth to explain, to tell them.
They left.
No, yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That happens so often. And the nice thing with the students, I often do that straight. And I have lots of students who are from other cultural background. And we have lots of fun by going through all of these differences and identifying that. And then there is another one chipping in. Or a very simple one, and that's an interesting one, where people really, really quickly adapt. That's the queuing in the UK. In England, you have to queue. Yeah. And in the post office, everywhere you go, you queue. And the interesting thing, when you ask a lecture room full of people, what is the thing you adapt easiest in the UK? That's exactly the queuing. And I know it. Yeah, I know it myself. When I was queuing and coming from Austria, everyone just ran to the counter or desk or whatever. You do not queue. No. But in the UK, I started to queue. And everyone agreed when they start to queue, then they get really annoyed about their people from their own culture when they don't queue. So when I went back on the flight to Austria, and people were just running straight beside me, and I just looked and I said, "You have to queue now." And I thought, on earth, what am I doing now? I'm both now. And this is the first time when you start to understand that you have acculturated, adapted to culture, when you do things what they do there, and then you combine your own way of being with the new way of being.
Yeah.
And that's what you can see a lot in courses, in classes, where people accommodate to each other.
Yeah.
And learn, absolutely.
Vas, do the students have some questions, or do you want us to talk more? You want to show your chart?
Yeah, I want to show a couple of communication, and specifically in the context of high-low context.
Yeah.
So one slide here, for example, shows how people sort of get the message across. And as we said, the English kind of culture, let's call it, Anglo-Saxon, getting directly to the point, Oriental sort of beating around the bush. And it seems like a little funny thing, but where it really matters, going back to that context, sometimes when you have, let's say, Americans doing business in Japan, I witnessed in many cases saying what you think is perceived as a good thing here in the United States, but can be perceived as arrogant, offensive, rude in, for example, Japan or China. And the other way around, when you have an employee from countries that are high context, where people are trying, like not comfortable saying no and trying to convey the message in a subtle way, sometimes they can be perceived here as indecisive, or maybe even, trying to deceive you. And so why didn't you say so? Well, that's, how sort of things work. And so it also seems to me, and we're actually conducting a study now, the second semester, collecting data through X-Culture, trying to see how much importance is placed in different cultures on how basically different ways to transmit a message. And again, in the United States, for example, it usually would be what is said, that's what matters. But in other cultures, when you have a business meeting, students tell us that more is conveyed by, for example, the place of the meeting, or who is present at the meeting, or where at the table they put you, or how, what time of the day the meeting was scheduled for. And so my American students say, like, why would it matter? I mean, like, where at the table I sit, or which of the conference rooms they chose.
Because that's
high cultures, they say, no, that's exactly the message. I mean, what they say, they'll probably just say some nice neutral things. But by looking at those all contextual cues, that's where I kind of get the message. Is my boss happy with me or not? Am I going to get that promotion or not? And so that's where it becomes a little difficult. Another thing that I would like to show here again, sometimes people don't recognize that there is a difference, how we communicate. Let me again share my screen here for a second. How we communicate. We assume that we have the same sort of communication style, but like, for example, numbers. I remember when I came from Europe to the United States,
how you count.
Numbers, we use the same numbers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
For example, American one is always like this, whereas the European one, I don't want to use my board behind me, but it would kind of have this kind of hook, like, what 7 looks like. And so my perfectly normal European 7 was often read by my professors as 1, and the other way around. So, like what's wrong with that? Because European 7 has this, additional cross. So this 7 would be, my 1 would often be seen to them as 7. Then again, American 4 is a little different than European 4. And so the European 4 sometimes looks like a 6 to Americans, because the American 6 doesn't have that hook on the top, and European 6 does. And with the same thing with the 9. European 9 looks like a G to Americans. And again, little things, but especially when you're a student, those things matter. And then obviously we have all kinds of nonverbal communication. Especially confusing is, like, for example, in some cultures, this is, nodding is yes, and this is no. But if you go to Bulgaria or Albania, and I did check countries, it's the opposite. And so sometimes it may be confusing. Likewise, some Latin American cultures or Italians, they use gestures all the time. So they seem to have like a gesture for every word, pizza pronto, signora, principessa. And again, it's kind of funny to observe. But again, when they see, let's say, an Asian communicating who usually, are more restrained, to them, they look like very cold, very, like, what's wrong with him? He's not happy with me, or he's not happy with the situation. And vice versa, when Asians observe people who are very expressive in their communication styles, stand close, in many cases, it can be perceived as way too hot, rude and, loud and offensive. Another thing that I've noticed myself, and I've read a lot about, use of silence. In Asia, especially in Japan, sometimes during the business meetings, and I've been in those situations myself and found it a little awkward. So I was invited, for example, to give a couple of lectures at a couple of schools of Japan. And so afterwards, we had a meeting with the dean and the professors there. And so we wanted to talk about student exchange and things like that. And so occasionally they would just all, pardon my language, but sort of shut up. So they just don't talk. And, you know, for 5 seconds, I can sustain it. 10 seconds, I become sort of nervous.
嗯
Seconds, you know, what's going on? And so I always try to say something, but it seems like, according to the literature, when I try to say something, when I don't give that time to, you know, reflect, they would perceive me as, you know, that guy just wouldn't shut up. And to me, it's like, what's wrong? Why nobody's talking? And so again, that may lead to different interpretations of, you know, how happy we are. Are we going to have a contract? Are we happy with one another? So little things, but sometimes lead to miscommunication and misinterpretation of the messages.
I think that what I tell my students is the final, I always close every discussion on this, is do not assume sameness. If you come in with assuming, and there's little things that we never think about that would be different. If we assume that they are like us, then we go into it with a potential conflict in mind. If we don't assume sameness, but you have to be curious, you have to be patient, you don't have to be pressed for a project or time. So I can imagine the student teams that haven't created some of those relationships may have a harder time as the deadlines get closer. And if there's no trust in the teams, that's when things fall apart. But sometimes you could be in the same culture and you have the same issues in the same company from the same state. So for me, when I was thinking of Vas, you asked the biggest differences in cross-cultural communication and conflict, I would say it's the dimension of relationship and task that we first talked about. And then it's the difference in time orientation. I think time orientation, if someone comes from a more polychronic, slower paced, more spontaneous versus a, you know, more to the point and direct time orientation, there's challenge. And then finally, I also think direct and indirect style can create conflict. So if we know people and we know what to expect, it makes it easier. And then just like any communication is try to understand where the other person's coming from and find common ground.
Can I ask you one more question? Oh, so go ahead, Ursula.
I've just seen before, I think it was yours, Vas, that you showed the linear active, the reactive, and the multi-active from Richard Lewis.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of work regarding that, and together with Richard Lewis, with the company as well. And that is some way, a nice way forward to understanding. It's a bigger concept than we have with Hofstede and Trompenaars, but it shows a fascinating up here exactly. It shows a fascinating approach where you have linear active cultures, which are task-oriented, linear planners. Then you have, these are the blue ones. Then you have the multi-active, the red ones. You can see the cultures next to it, and the reactive ones. And that is fascinating because I know from Richard Lewis himself, when he set it up, that he put people into rooms when they didn't believe that people behave in that way, and gave them a task to do, and put all the linear active people after self-assessment into one room. In another room, there were all the multi-actives, and then all the reactives in a room. And all had exactly the same task to do. He opened the room, the first one. The linear actives were sitting there using database and using stats, and were really very logical in their approach. The reactives were very calm, were waiting for each other to one after the other to give an opinion, and it was very, very calm. It was reacting to the other one's opinion. And then he opened the room with the multi-actives. They were standing on the table, they were shouting, they were talking, they were hugging each other, and were solving in their way the task. And I've done a lot of research with that and found fascinating examples that this is deep-rooted. And going back to Hall, what we just said about the high and low context, that we have that in our way, even going back in an evolutionary way, that we behave because of that. And my recent, if I can quickly show you one of my slides, where I have done my research into that, and it's really fascinating. I've used all sorts of people, and I need to add it to the share. I hope I can bring it. Yeah.
The little green button.
And while we are opening, so we have a few minutes, students. I still would like to ask 2 questions if we have time.
Okay.
But if you have any questions, one, you can type them in the Q&A window, or 2, there is a button there that looks like raise your hand. So if you press that button, we will add you to the discussion and you will be able to ask your questions. So hopefully we'll have a little time for that as well. And it seems like
you can see that
here, so yeah.
Can you see the slide now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The communication logic.
I had people with all sorts of different multiple cultural backgrounds, and they came out pretty much the same. They had both. They had logical, they had emotional, but they also had reactive parts. And all these others came to the UK, and they started to adapt to the cultural profile. This is a UK profile. And then you could see the Germanics, the linear actives, the Indians, the Saudi Arabians, Africans, to China, and all adapted, interestingly, to the UK, but kept their own profiles. And moreover, which is interesting, all cultures behave in a logical way, have emotional parts in them, and have evolutionary parts. Just to show you that it is absolutely fascinating.
Is that a survey that you administer? Or?
Yeah. I had
survey, because as I said, we're doing some research specifically on this communication profile, and so we didn't find anything, so had to come up with our own set of questions.
Exactly.
But I wonder if you maybe can send us what you have. Maybe we can also validate it using your instrument.
Absolutely. I mean, this is fascinating, and it is a way forward now to have, in combination with the cultural profiles of Louis, you can find it out that deep-rooted connections are there. And if we tap into these, we can find the logic behind an argumentation, but also what Tatiana said, we can find the trust-building side, which is really strong in the reactive cultures, and also the emotional relationship building from the multi-active. So there is a beautiful way forward to tap into our cultural profiles, which is much more in common than separates us around the globe.
Right. There is one more issue that I would like to bring in. I really wish it wasn't, towards the end, because it's one that is a little bit more sensitive, but our own research shows it, and I've seen a lot of studies that also say that, sometimes in international teams, people are attributed different status and different expertise, sort of based on, at least I've seen 2 factors. One, country of origin, and 2, proficiency in the working language. So the last one, for example, I do an experiment with my students. I borrowed the idea from a published study, but I always do it with my students. I recorded several colleagues talk about the same topic in the same language. In my case, it was influenza, the flu virus. And so some people talk with an accent, others talk without an accent. And then I would show those different videos to different groups of students and ask them to rate how well do they think people know the topic. And so they say essentially exactly the same thing. But invariably, people who speak with an accent often are perceived as less knowledgeable in the area because, it seems to me that, just like children sometimes make mistakes when they talk or cannot easily, formulate sentences, it almost seems like it's subconscious. And what's interesting, at least from my own observations, it has nothing to do with sort of prejudice and superiority per se. In many cases, Canadians, Americans have done it in both countries, are a little bit more indifferent whether or not the person speaks with an accent, maybe because they see enough people with an accent and know that it doesn't really tell it the expertise. But sometimes you see people who come from countries where they have not been exposed to foreigners, and in many cases they actually rate people who speak with an accent lower. Likewise, again, we're actually doing a study on that right now, but we've seen some research prior. Again, sort of the economic development of your home country. It's almost as if, how can you know something about international business when your country doesn't even have running water?
Which is my argument with my dean initially. That's how it all started for me. Interesting.
So what can we do about that other than be cognizant of this effect and sort of make sure that everybody's given a chance to speak? Because just because the person comes, let's say, from a poor country or speaks with an accent doesn't mean by any means that the person is less knowledgeable. What would be the advice to for example, members of the cross-cultural teams? Because one thing, as I said, we're doing a study now on peer evaluations, and it seems like there is some bias. So it seems like there is a correlation between the economic development of the country where the student comes from and the peer evaluations the students get. And as I said, what's interesting, it's not like people from rich countries discriminate against those from poor countries. It almost seems like people from poor countries discriminate from, against people from other poor
countries. Yeah.
And so can we do anything about that? Because it seems like there is some effect going on there. So what would be the advice you would give to members of the teams, to managers of the teams? Can we do even anything about that?
I mean, it's more what the people say than rather than the accent which counts. And I know it from my own student. I just had a load of students and from all over the world. And there was someone who had made lots of mistakes. But the essence was fascinating what they had to say. So you need to listen more what people have to say. Yeah, and take it the other way around. If people are in fluent in one language, but don't know the other one. So I mean, everyone is a foreigner in another country.
Well, an accent is a sign that the person speaks at least two languages, right?
Exactly. And let's take the German accent was always seen that it's a mad scientist.
That's true. So likewise, when you watch movies, like for example, I don't know, Star Wars, the year 2500 something, and somehow the villains always speak with the British accent, the rebels always speak with an American accent. So you sort of kind of send a message based on that. Yeah.
I spend a third of our MBA first year class is international. And because I'm the only non-English, we have a lot of international faculty, but no one teaches communication when English is not their first language. So I kind of shift their paradigms a little bit. I talk to them regardless of teams, of them managing their brand. If you come here from Africa or from India and your proficiency or your enunciation of certain words triggers to the audience that they're not going to understand you. Remember, first impressions are very, very short to build. You are going to be swimming upstream, as we say. You will have a difficult time. So you have to be self-aware first and make changes, either slow down, work on your pronunciation, practice a lot of listening and speaking so you can be, you don't have to change who you are, but you need to be aware that you are the outsider trying to assimilate. So first of, I would coach the students that this bias exists and they have to manage their own brand. So if the person comes from a poor economic country, they better step up to show off what they can do. But the also same thing happens with introverts. Introverts don't speak up as much as meetings. If they know that about themselves, they have to be the ones to ask for the agenda early on. They have to be the ones after the meeting to share their thoughts, but they have to be proactive. They need to be aware that the perception is that they're lazy. The perception is if they don't talk that they don't care. So I do a lot of coaching on brand management on the people that may be from those areas. And then also for understanding, as you said, Americans who speak one language may be in a minority. Everyone else speaks two or three maybe, and they have to be the ones to adapt, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to manage cross-cultural teams. So we do a lot of coaching in both areas. The teams of us in cross-culture, X-culture, I would say, this has to be an awareness building from the beginning for people to realize what are their own mental filters and what will they have to really think through as they hear and work with others.
And it probably brings us back to where we started, spend time to get to know each other.
Yeah.
In many cases, you will realize that the student from Ghana actually comes from the top one university in that country. And the fact that some of those international students participate in X-culture also means that they are at a university that teaches in English. And so that's basically like a equivalent of Harvard in their country.
Yeah.
And you may not even realize that until you get to know them.
Yeah.
can I as well add something from the United Kingdom, from England? Because obviously it is always seen that England is the country with a nice English accent, and I can reassure all the students who listen, who come from other countries, it is sometimes very, very difficult to understand someone from Liverpool, from Newcastle, Scotland, Wales, and all these parts of the UK. And I have seen that where students really struggled when there were professors with an accent from these parts of the UK. So don't worry, that is often not even easy to have lectures in the UK by native speakers to be well understood by people from other countries. And that should be something encouraging, because we all have our dialects, and when these dialects are coming across very strongly, you have difficulties to understand. So don't worry, but even native speakers have their strong accents. So.
Well, we're pretty much out of time here. So one example I want to give, again, since you mentioned British versus American and accents, one thing that puzzles me is that we not only write numbers differently, but we call numbers differently. So somewhere I read that, so in the United States, 1 with 9 zeros is a billion. And in Britain, they call it a milliard. And then, so 12 zeros in the United States, that would be the trillion. And then in the United Kingdom, apparently that's what they call a billion.
Billion.
You happen to be an accountant, literally the number of
nightmare.
The number of zeros will have a different
nightmare. How about the period versus the dot?
Yeah, that's another one.
In Europe, or the dates. You know,
the date, don't even do this on
2211, not 2311, not yes.
With the dates, you know, when it's the fall semester, then it's a little bit easier, because then you can, by the date, you can tell if it's the month or a date. But in the spring, you have like somebody's semester starts on 1/5.
Yes.
So would it be 1st of May or 5th of January? And like, man, come on. Yes. So.
Those are the great things. I think that's what makes, for our students to be successful, they have to be cultural chameleons. They've got to figure out that there are differences, quickly learn how to flex, not feel bad about it, and know that they are building their global awareness muscle that will take them across so many opportunities than if they didn't have it. It's not easy, but nothing that's rewarding is easy. So that's my closing line.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole purpose of X-Culture, to expose people to this experience. We may not make you a super expert, but at least you will have an experience. You will know what to expect next time, and hopefully you will know better how to react and how to deal with it.
Sure. Sure. Do you have us, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you have students that have graduated from X-Culture do a best practices or do a round table that our students, because mine are jumping in January, but they can see first? Do you do something like that, that's sort of like lessons learned or best practices? Conversation.
It's a very good question. Yes and no. So on the one hand, yes, because we have the coaching program, and they always do sort of like a closing, you know, round table discussion, experience sharing. And then we have what we call the academy students. So the non-university students, we have several hundred of them this semester, who are either working professionals who came applied individually, or we also have a separate group of kids, pre-college teens.
Mm-hmm.
So with them, we do have those big, you know, round table discussions, experience sharing. They have to write a reflection paper at the end. So what did I learn? With the university students, because we have almost 6,000 of them, it's just impossible to do. And so what we do or hope to do is that most professors organize some sort of a discussion in their own class. And I know many professors actually do have like a debrief where they share experiences, they talk about what they learned. Some actually have a round of presentations on that, and in fact, some even dedicate several lectures to that. We even have university president or, you know, the dean of the business school to see those presentations.
Wow. But when they come and they sign up to X-Culture, I would love, even if there was a 30-minute discussion of welcome, here's what you can expect. And it's from students that they discuss their experiences, learning tips, because they know nothing. I mean, they don't know what they're getting themselves into.
That's a very, very good idea. Again, at my school, what we do is we invite the last semester students to do presentations to this semester students, but again, that would be local. I don't know, maybe we should record those meetings.
Just pick 5 students, you facilitate, just like put it in a recording and then put it up for them to watch so they know kind of what they're getting into.
Let's think about that. So one thing we will always do, so with the professors, so sometime in a week or 2, we will have like a final meeting of the professors where we share experience. Yeah. And maybe let's bring up one of the issues, what can we do along these lines for the students? Would it be sort of a webinar, have a few speakers and they share it with everybody, or would it be more like a round table where everybody can participate? Or will it, as I said, the challenge always is just the sheer size. We have so many people that it's almost impossible.
No, I would just pick 5 students, you facilitate, put them on a Zoom, 30 minutes.
Maybe we'll do it.
Highs and lows. Just go through there. What works, what doesn't work.
That's a very, very good idea. And it's a whole different story when, you know, when students themselves tell from their own experience.
Yes. We are the grown-ups. They don't want to hear us.
What surprises me,
they're in the class. I shouldn't say that, but I think they would prefer hearing it from students.
Yeah, what surprises me, Tatiana, sometimes is that, you know, it's been 10 years and we do it 4 times a year. So it's like 40 times now. And some of these obvious, simple ideas, you know, like it takes us 40 runs before somebody says, why don't we do this? And everybody like, so yeah, why not? Maybe start in 2020, you know, I don't mind it. And I think it's a brilliant idea. And we can even do a few rounds. I mean, it doesn't have to, because not everyone can attend at a specific time. So maybe we can even do a couple of rounds.
Yeah.
Well, I just realized, and it's a very good sign of, you know, a very good discussion, that we are not only way past our time, but the coaches have their own webinar at 11. So
we better go. We better leave the room. I have corrected you both on LinkedIn, so that's my way to stay connected.
Oh, great.
Normally, yes. About 15 to 20 minutes, and somehow the hour passed by so quickly.
So quickly.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'll borrow some of your ideas for my own lectures if you don't mind.
Great. Same for me.
Thank you. So,
great. Have a great
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.